it was the week before Brother Downs came, you preached on Colossians 1, and then Brother Downs preached on Colossians 3, and I preached on Colossians 2. I don't know if you remember all of those things that happened, but in the book of Colossians, Colossians chapters 1 and 2 are this theology of Christ is central to everything in the Christian life. He is preeminent over all things, that what we do is about Christ and comes from Christ. And it's this theological laying out of it. And chapter 3 is the applications of that. Submitting to in the family, submitting in the workplace, forgiving, living in love, staying away from sin, all of those things. And all of those things are, it's theological truth and it's application, and it's this universal truth that, Paul could have sent to any church and would have been equally applicable because it's the theology of what is true. In chapter 4, it's like Paul is adding on this last personal note just to the church of Colossae, because he knows the church of Colossae, and he's partnering with them Paul is a missionary. He's writing from prison right now, from prison in Rome, and he loves the church at Colossae, and he wants to leave this last personal note that is specifically for them. And that's where we get to when we get to chapter 4. And he, as a missionary, wants to have a relationship with this church. He wants to have a partnership with them. And the central part of this that makes this relationship and this partnership work is the gospel. That's what the partnership is all about. You're going to see it in all that he talks about. He's going to this relationship that he has with the church is centered in his desire for the gospel to go out and the church's desire for the gospel to go out. So we're going to look at that in 3 different ways. Read with me, first of all, starting in Colossians 4, starting verse 2. We'll read verses 2 through 4. Continue in prayer and watch in the same with thanksgiving. With all, praying also for us, that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds, he's in prison, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. So Paul starts in verse 2 there with this general necessity to pray. He says, continue in prayer. He wants the church to be praying. He doesn't want them to forget that prayer is an important part of the Christian life. He says continue in prayer. He wants them to keep doing it, to not stop praying. And then he tells them how he wants them to pray. Continue in prayer and watch in the same. In other words, they're supposed to be looking out, being alert. They're watching for in prayer. So it's not just, Paul doesn't want their prayers to just be, I hope you bless everyone, and I hope everything goes well for everybody. He wants them to be alert to the needs that there are and the things going on in people's life that need to be prayed for. He wants them to watch in prayer so that it matters that you're looking for the need that there is that needs to be prayed for, and you're the one who's praying. When I worked at I don't know if you know Tim Hortons. How many people here know Tim Hortons? I don't think there's one around here. Okay, it's mostly a Canadian thing, but there was one in Michigan in the area where I lived when I was in high school. So in high school, it's like a donut cafe shop. And I would work there, and I ran the sandwich station. And so if I ever was low on bagels or sausage or egg or something like that, I was supposed to call over to the oven section and say, hey, I'm low and I need to get some more. At the beginning, I was very bad at it, and so I'd run out of bagels and I'd need a new bagel, and I'd realize, oh, there's no more. And then I'd say to the oven station, they'd say, it's going to be 10 minutes. And then all the people who came in line in those 10 minutes who ordered a bagel, we'd tell them, oh, we have them in the oven. We don't have any available right now. Sorry, and it would be my fault. What I got to learn to do was I would not only be making the sandwiches, but I would be looking to see, okay, how many bagels do we have? Should I send for some? How many sausages? How many eggs? How many, of each of the different things, so that I knew when to tell the oven, and then they would put it in, and it would come in just in time, so there was never a time where I had too much, or never a time where I ran out. In other words, I was always watching. Paul says prayer should be like that. We should be watching for the needs ahead of time, so that we can be praying for them. Praying for them specifically. It's not just general prayer, it's specific prayer. And he says, watch in the same with thanksgiving. In other words, all of our prayers should be coded in thanksgiving for what God has already done. We shouldn't ever, as we look for all of the needs and think of all the requests we have, don't forget, God's done so much for us already. We should be coding it in thanksgiving. And then he says what he wants. Look at verse 3, with all praying also for us. He says, look, you need to be praying, you need to be watching for those needs, but on a personal note, Paul says, I need you to pray for me. Paul's in prison right now. So if I were in prison, I know what I would be asking for. I would be asking to not be in prison. That's not what Paul asks for. He says, with all praying also for us, that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which all I am also in bonds. Paul's prayer is for opportunities to present the gospel. He's there in prison. He can't go just anywhere he wants. He's looking for opportunities, even in prison, to present the gospel. That's what he needs prayer for more than anything else. He wants opportunities to speak the mystery of Christ. What's the mystery of Christ? That phrase, that terminology about mystery and mystery of Christ is mentioned at the beginning of the book of Colossians and in a couple of other places in Paul's letters. And it always refers to this idea of the bringing together of Jews and Gentiles to worship Christ, to worship Jesus Christ. In other words, it's a mystery because in the Old Testament, people never would have imagined that Jews and Gentiles would come and worship Jesus Christ together. Jews and Gentiles didn't worship together. Gentiles couldn't come into the places of the temple where Jews could come into. This idea that all of these people could come together and worship together, unheard of. And Paul says, Christ offers the gospel to all people, to Jews and to Gentiles, which was true in the Old Testament. And now he's bringing them together into a community to worship himself. What we have here tonight, a church where it doesn't matter Jew, Gentile, whatever race you are, it doesn't matter man or woman or rich or poor, we all come together to worship Christ. And that's the mystery that people in the Old Testament couldn't have imagined, that regardless of race or male or female, male and female makes a difference and race makes a difference, but in the church, we come together to worship Christ the same way. And he says, that's the mystery I want. I want to talk to these people who aren't part of the church. They don't understand the gospel, and I want to spread this and build the church. And so he says he needs prayer. He needs prayer from the Colossians to have these opportunities, because without these opportunities, he can't do it. And then he says in verse 4 something else he wants prayer for, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. So he's saying, I want to make it manifest means to make it clear, to reveal, so that when he presents the gospel, there's not confusion, is not a problem with people understanding what the gospel is really about. He wants to make it clear to them. And so he says, I want you to pray that when I present the gospel, when these opportunities come that you've been praying for, that I'd be able to present it clearly. That's what he asks for. And there's one other thing he wants. He wants boldness. It's not mentioned specifically here in Colossians, but at the same time, Paul is writing Colossians, he's also writing Ephesians, because he sends both the book of Colossians and the book of Ephesians with Tychicus and Onesimus to go to this area, and they're going to give both of these letters, one to Colossae and one to Ephesus. And he has a very similar passage in Ephesians. If you turn with me to Ephesians chapter 6, we'll read the prayers that he wants there in Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 18 through 21. And he says, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. Sounds very similar to Colossians. And for me, that utterance may be given unto me, that I may open my mouth boldly, to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, that therein I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. It's almost completely parallel to Colossians. And twice he mentions, I need to speak boldly. In other words, pray not only that I'd have the opportunities, pray not only that I would be able to speak clearly when the opportunities come, pray that I would be bold in taking those opportunities to do the things. And you think, this is Paul. He's already been through a shipwreck. He's been beaten and stoned, and he's been bold all the way through. Does he really need prayer for boldness? And he says, yes, he still needs prayer for boldness as a missionary to go out. And that's true of all missionaries, of all of the missionaries that, as we get that prayer and praise sheet each Wednesday, those missionaries, what they probably want more than anything, more than money or even physical health, is they're looking for opportunities to present the gospel, clarity in presenting the gospel, and boldness to take those opportunities. When I have talked to the missionaries, Brother Tyler and Brother Priam and other missionaries that I've traveled to, they don't say, I just wish churches would send more money. I really need more money. There's financial problems all the time, but the thing that drives them, or the things that discourages them, is if they don't know that people are praying for them, because they want prayer that the gospel would go out, because prayer is so much more powerful than money. And that's what the missionaries want more than anything, that there would be people praying that the gospel would go out like that. And so Paul says we should pray for our missionaries in that way, for boldness, for clarity, for opportunities to present the gospel. That's Paul's primary request for what the Colossians should do. But he also says he knows that what the Colossians need to be also doing right there in Colossae. Look with me at verse 5 and 6. Walk in wisdom toward them that are without, redeeming the time. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. Okay, what's the center of this partnership? Paul has a relationship with this church. He has a partnership, and the center of it is the gospel. And so he says, I'm now in prison for preaching the gospel, and I'm looking for more opportunities to preach the gospel. Please pray for me. And I'm asking that, so while you're there in Colossians, walk in wisdom toward them that are without. In other words, to unbelievers. Walk in such a way that your testimony is shining out, so that you don't lose your testimony there in the community there. Because what a shame would it be if Paul goes all the way over to Rome to preach the gospel, and the church at Colossians is supporting him, and then there in Colossae, the testimony for Christ is lost because people stop serving Christ, stop looking for opportunities to share the gospel, and the testimony of Christ dies there in Colossae. And he says, don't let that happen. Use your testimony for evangelism. Walk in wisdom toward them that are without. And then he says, redeeming the time. He urges the Colossians to make good use of their time. Redeem means to buy back, to use time in such a way that it's used to its full capacity. Because in the end, you only have so much time that you have in your life. At some point, you're going to die, and then that's the end. You have no more opportunities to share the gospel with those that are around, the people who are around you. And also, we as Christians only have so much time. Christ is going to come back, and then we're gone. And now is our time to be getting the gospel out, to be showing, having a right testimony in the community and showing that to other people. Redeem the time. Use the time that we have. there's not any time to be wasted. It's not just enough to pray for the other opportunities that are around the world. We should be walking in wisdom here. And then he also mentions how they use their speech. In verse 6, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. It's not only their behavior, the way that they walk, it's also that every word they use would be a testimony to Christ. He says specifically that their speech would be full of grace, that they would be forgiving, loving, gracious. And that when we speak with grace, people notice that. Because in general, the world around us does not speak with grace. They don't speak with forgiveness. They don't speak with love. There's backbiting and lying and hatred. And when we speak with grace, it is a testimony of who Christ is. And Paul says, don't lose that. Don't lose that testimony that you have there in Colossae. And then he says, your speech should be seasoned with salt, which is a metaphor. We put salt on things to make it more flavorful, more appealing to people. He says your speech should be pleasant. It shouldn't be crude or mean. You know how when a telemarketer calls, how you want to talk to the telemarketer? That's not speech seasoned with salt. There it is. That's what seasoned with salt means. And when we have interactions with people all the time where they're used to non-believers coming in and the customer service, or you're at a store, or something goes wrong and you were really wronged. And there's lots of opportunities to use other types of speech that show how you feel about the situation. And Paul says that opportunity right there when you're speaking to that non-believer is an opportunity for you to show who Christ is, because you should know how ye ought to answer every man. You should speak in such a way that they say, they expect you to get angry, and